as I feared. Someone in this restaurant is infected with the highly contagious clam flu.
Apparently, SpongeBob SquarePants predicted COVID? No, this isn't some weird conspiracy theory. I'm talking about an actual episode of SpongeBob that was written before the pandemic, got banned, and somehow nailed the plot of 2020. Like the Simpsons predicting everything from iPhones to actual presidents. The writers of SpongeBob has some explaining to do because the parallels are freaky. Let's get into why this episode was basically SpongeBob's crystal ball for 2020, why it was banned, and how the health inspector finally got his revenge for Nasty Patty after like almost 20 years. Dude can hold a grudge. Buckle up because we're about to dive into the SpongeBob SquarePants episode, Quarantined Crab. Alright, so for anyone who hasn't seen the episode, mainly because it got pulled from rotation faster than Plankton gets thrown out of the Crusty Crab, let's recap what goes down in the Quarantined Crab. It is a SpongeBob SquarePants episode from season 12. In this episode, the Crusty Crab goes under emergency quarantine, but no one knows who carries the mysterious illness. The episode begins at the Krusty Krab, where Mr. Krabs is greeting his girls, Mrs. Puff and Pearl. Meanwhile, Patrick is taking a long time to order something, getting on Squidward's last nerve as usual. SpongeBob says hi to Mrs. Puff, but Mrs. Puff reminds him that they should pretend not to know each other when they are not at school. SpongeBob then serves 2 Krabby Patties to Mrs. Puff and Pearl by spitting them out of his eyes. Very gross. Out of nowhere, the local health inspector appears. He pulls out a device and scans the room, declaring the Krusty Krab to be a health hazard. He says that someone in the restaurant has a case of the disease known as clam flu and puts the restaurant under quarantine, locking everyone inside. This causes everyone except for SpongeBob to run around, screaming and panicking. Patrick then asks what a quarantine actually is, and SpongeBob replies that it is like a mandatory sleepover. Squidward debunks this, saying that a quarantine is when a group of people are forced to be locked in a room with a sick person, until eventually everyone gets sick. Overhearing everything that has just happened and not wanting to get sick himself, Plankton comes out of a nearby soda cup, saying that he is abandoning Operation Soda Jerk. He escapes via the restaurant's funnel, but is immediately lasered by a hazmat fish, prompting everyone else to stay inside so they are not barbecued for trying to escape like Plankton. Pearl complains, but Mr. Krabs says that back in his Navy days, when one of his fellow sailors got sick, they would isolate the sicko and lock them in the freezer so that the others can enjoy their good health. When Mrs. Puff asks if they let the sicko out of the freezer once he got better, because you know they would otherwise freeze to death, Mr. Krabs hesitates and says that somebody probably let them out eventually. Mr. Krabs asks if anyone is feeling sick, to which nobody responds, prompting him to use a pair of tongs as a threat. This causes Squidward to freak out and bump into a table, launching a pepper shaker into the air and into SpongeBob's nose, causing him to sneeze. Everyone assumes that SpongeBob has the disease, even though he clearly doesn't. I think the parallel starts here, because this part reminds me of the time during COVID where everyone was afraid to sneeze in front of people, because during COVID times, allergies or the common cold was not a thing anymore. It's either you had COVID or you don't. So you would panic at any cough, immediately thinking that the person had COVID or wondered if they did. So at this point, if anyone so much as coughs, they get thrown into the freezer, which by the way basically becomes a containment zone like a jail for anyone showing symptoms. It's like SpongeBob went full CDC. I'm just saying, you could slap a face mask on Squidward and it'd be 2020 all over again. Poor SpongeBob states that he will go into the freezer willingly, despite not feeling sick. He tries to have an emotional speech, but he is cut short when Mr. Krabs slams the door in his face. It is then revealed that SpongeBob is having fun in the freezer, sledding on a mountain of snow and eating ice cream, even though they think his screams are him suffering and not him having the time of his life in the freezer. Just like how for most introverts, outside being closed and being forced to isolate was the best thing that could ever happen to us. While there are people that were suffering during this time of isolation, we were just fine. Anyways, everyone is relieved as they think the worst of the quarantine is over. Patrick looks over and notices SpongeBob enjoying an ice cream cone. He then pretends to be sick by rubbing relish all over himself. This causes everyone to freak out, and Patrick ends up getting locked in the freezer. SpongeBob and Patrick end up having a snowball fight with chocolate ice cream having the time of their life. Mr. Krabs, Squidward, Mrs. Puff, and Pearl are sitting at a table, paranoid if anyone else has the disease. Squidward itches his arm, and Pearl accuses him of having the clam flu. Mr. Krabs throws Squidward in the freezer. Mrs. Puff then yawns, making Mr. Krabs freak out, and he locks her in the freezer as well. Pearl remembers that she still had money left over from last time she went to the mall. This makes Mr. Krabs think that the flu has poisoned Pearl's mind, and he locks her in the freezer too. In the freezer, everyone meets inside an igloo, and Squidward finds out that nobody in the freezer is actually sick. Mrs. Puff then deduced that Mr. Krabs is the one with the sickness, causing Pearl to cry. Squidward decides that the only option is to break out of the freezer and lock Mr. Krabs inside. Everyone agrees, except for SpongeBob, who is reluctant at first. Squidward convinces him by explaining that he cannot make Krabby Patties if he is locked in the freezer. And SpongeBob accepts it as he puts his sunglasses on to put the crab on ice. Everyone busts out of the freezer, much to Mr. Krabs' surprise. Patrick tries to attack him, but Krabs shrinks himself down and hides under the grill. SpongeBob chases Mr. Krabs under the grill and tries to convince him to go willingly, but Mr. Krabs refuses and goes down a pipe leading to the grease trap. SpongeBob comes out from under the grill, covered in mold and unaware of what to do. Squidward then says somebody has to go down there and get Mr. Krabs out before he escapes into the sewers and infects the whole town. Patrick lifts up the grill and shoves Squidward through the pipe, not knowing there was a hatch that leads down there, covering him in grease. After seeing Squidward and had sicko germs from Squidward's sneeze, Mr. Krabs escapes the grease trap and runs into the dining room. Pearl gives chase, but Mr. Krabs gets stuck in her blowhole. Pearl sneezes him out, but he loses his shirt in the processes, causing her blowhole to get plugged up. Patrick corners Mr. Krabs, and they begin to fight. During the fight, Mr. Krabs throws Patrick into the broom closet, covering him in dust. Patrick grabs Mr. Krabs with his tongue and throws him to Mrs. Puff, who catches him in a garbage can. She puffs up, causing trash to fall all over her. Later that night after the battlefield, the health inspector returns to the Crusty Crab and goes inside. He says that he made a mistake. It is surprisingly revealed that he had been holding his tracking equipment upside down when he came by earlier yesterday, meaning nobody actually had clam flu. However, he finds out that everyone now has a different disease, and Mr. Krabs has a combination of all 5 diseases due to the fight they had earlier of a failure plan to send him back to the freezer. The health inspector panics and runs out of the restaurant, yelling that everyone is actually sick and declares an ultra mega quarantine. A team of hazmat units lock the Krusty Krab inside of a crate and airlift it over to the chum bucket where it is dropped. Plankton is heard begging the gang to stay away so he does not get sick, only to end up sneezing, revealing that he was the one with clam flu the whole time as the episode ends. That ending was crazy, but if you're a die-hard SpongeBob fan, this probably crossed your mind when watching this episode. I think it was the health inspector's revenge, because what do you mean you had the device upside down? This man has been plotting his comeback for 18 years. I know you remember the Nasty Patty episode where SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs basically thought they murdered the health inspector with a gross poisonous Krabby Patty. They tried to feed him a toilet water, sweaty sock, poisonous patty, then buried him alive and repeated gave this man a concussion. I think the health inspector has been quietly holding on to his grudge, and can you blame him? But this episode led some fans to believe that SpongeBob kinda predicted COVID-19. This episode aired in 2020, but it was written well before anyone knew what a coronavirus was. SpongeBob's writers didn't have insider info from the CDC, unless SpongeBob is secretly a health official, in which case plot twist. But let's review. 1. Lockdown? Check. 2. Quarantine for anyone with symptoms? Check. 3. Mass hysteria in the Krusty Krab? Double check. 4. Isolation, paranoia, and people losing their sanity? Is this SpongeBob or a flashback to Tiger King quarantine vibes? Clam flu sounds ridiculous, but we're living in a world where people use Tiger King to cope with isolation, so are we really surprised? The way the episode mirrors what happened in real life. And let's not forget the frozen quarantine zone. They basically created their own ICU in the Krusty Krab freezer. It's like Bikini Bottom's version of a hospital wing. Honestly, throw SpongeBob in a hazmat suit and it's too real. Now let's talk about why this episode got yeeted off the air. Nickelodeon was like, Maybe a quarantine episode during a literal global pandemic is too much, and they weren't wrong. People were already doom-scrolling Twitter, debating mask mandates, and hoarding toilet paper. SpongeBob talking about an infectious disease. That hit way too close to home for Nickelodeon, and they were like, let's shelf this one before Bikini Bottom starts panic buying Krabby Patties. But the episode wasn't exactly a direct COVID parody. I don't think it was meant to freak anyone out. It was just unfortunate timing that made it look like SpongeBob was straight up predicting the future, like The Simpsons. So Nickelodeon pulled the plug, and Quarantined Crab got buried in the same place they hid all of Squidward's hopes and dreams. Between predicting quarantine, infectious diseases, and the chaos that would be 2020, we've got a lot of questions for the writers of this show. But at the end of the day, Quarantined Crab is one of those episodes that will go down in history as SpongeBob's most eerily relevant moment. It might have been banned, but thanks to the internet and you, it lives on in meme form forever. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. What were your thoughts when you first saw this episode? Don't forget to like and subscribe and share with a friend. Thanks for watching. Until next time.